If you know a Steve Jobs product, you know that he likes simplicity. The very first Macintosh, for instance, had no cursor keys, even though every computer should have cursor keys. Similarly, he didn't want an off switch on the iPod. He wanted the fewest switches possible.
Especially in the polishing and the design, the aesthetics, the use, the interface. His personality is all over that. I mean, it was that typical Steve Jobs insistence on the best experience.
2/3 of the way through the development phase, the iPod hit a snag.
Towards the end of the development cycle, they were setting up the factories to make the thing, and they discovered that they had a problem with the power management.
About 3 months before the end of the project, we find out that the iPod is going dead after about 3 hours, even when it's turned off. And that battery life just isn't acceptable. The mood around the office was that we either fixed it or we might as well go home.
For 8 stressful weeks, engineers scrambled to fix the problem. Finally, they did. After months of round-the-clock work, the iPod was ready. Jobs sent an email to the media inviting them to the launch of a new Apple product. It simply read, "Hint, it's not a Mac." On the 23rd of October 2001, Steve Jobs unveiled Apple's newest creation.
The iPod introduction was another great moment of Steve. He shows up and he says, I've got this new thing I'm going to show you today, but I'm not going to bring it out right yet. And he kind of wanders around the stage and he whets the appetite and he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the iPod.
There it is, right there.
He says, this is the first day in a whole new revolution.
This amazing little device holds 1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
The place was filled with journalists who all looked at this and were going, what is this? Nobody really knew what he was up to.
No one was really expecting them to come out with an MP3 player.
It is now accessible to everybody to have 1,000 songs and find them and navigate them faster.
They basically just made it an incredibly easy to grasp proposition for most people.
When the iPod came out, Bill Gates was in New York City and was having a dinner for a few journalists. And I had just gotten my iPod, and I decided to bring it to that dinner. Bill Gates had not seen the iPod, and before I left, I showed it to Bill, and his eyes went like saucers, and he immediately started playing with it and taking it in. And he looked at me and he said, "This is only for Macintosh?"
But the timing of the iPod launch in October 2001 could not have been worse.
Well, the iPod was launched at the least auspicious time. Napster had just been sued and had lost. Everyone who had been sharing MP3 files was shell-shocked. Second of all, 9/11 had happened a month before. The country was shell-shocked. The dot-com meltdown had started earlier in the year, and the Silicon Valley economy was falling apart. There was very little reason to be excited about any kind of new product.
It was a little bit early in the market, and so no one was really sure how this digital music thing was going to play out. And so it seemed like Apple was making a pretty risky move into what was so far a pretty unproven market.
When the iPod first came out, a lot of people were very skeptical about it. It was quite expensive. It was $400. It was Mac only. People said the iPod stood for idiots price our devices, or I prefer owning discs, in reference to CD players.
Despite the early criticism, the iPod had a certain something.
There are a few different things that made the iPod really stand apart from the rest of the crowd. One is that it's excellent integration with iTunes. What Apple was able to achieve was a level of seamless integration with the software that almost no one else has been able to do.
The iPod, when it came out, was already not the best music player. That is, it wasn't the most capacious, it wasn't the least expensive. But what it was a fashion statement. It was a piece of jewelry. It was so beautiful.
It's one thing to have a bunch of songs on a device, but it's useless unless you can find what you're looking for. The competition did allow you to search by artist and album, but what it didn't do, once you got to a song list, you'd be clicking, click, click, all the way through, and when you have 5,000 songs on there or more, it's just not going to work. With the iPod, you'd start scrolling, you'd be like, and then it speeds up. It's like all the way through. And you're like, whoa, that was just mind-blowing.
Most important, the iPod had a band of Mac loyalists eager to embrace it.
Well, Apple started with an advantage which almost no other brand has, which is an incredibly loyal cult base of users. So when the iPod came out, it was grasped with enthusiasm by that group. It was a fantastic reason to evangelize the brand to their friends, to anyone else who would listen.
So sometimes tech products stay in tech and never make it out of the geek world. So from the very beginning, the people who adopted the iPod were these Mac loyalists. And in that group, there were some very other influential communities that helped start the conversation, and they were what I call the cultural creatives. If a product has sparked the interest of fashion, of car culture, of music, of sports, I mean, we're in so many areas of culture that now there's great momentum and an avalanche of interest starting with all the right people, and that's what happened with the iPod.
In its first 2 months, the iPod ended up in the hands and ears of about 125,000 people, including many of the world's trendsetters. That was important, but it wasn't enough. It would take a stroke of luck for the rest of the world to take notice. When the iPod was launched in late 2001, it proved an immediate hit with Macintosh enthusiasts. But it was a seemingly minor design detail that turned this electronic gadget into a fashion statement.
When the iPod first came out, it was, of course, Macintosh-only fans, younger people, urban people, began to see for the first time these white earbuds. White earbuds. No company had ever cared before about the color of the darn earbuds. But all of a sudden, that became a symbol, and people are like, what is that?
They made the earbuds white just because the player was white. They wanted to keep it consistent with the color of the player. But it turned out to be a brilliant piece of marketing because it advertised a player that's normally hidden in a pocket or a backpack, something that's invisible, something you don't see, and it made it very visible.
You're walking down the street, you see a cool person, and you see some visible accessory that you've never seen before. And you think, what's that, and why is that guy wearing it? And then you see it again, and then you see it again. And then suddenly you start taking notice that every person I see with those white earbuds is a cool-looking person. And then you start really wanting it. You want to be part of that community.
Now, Apple picked up on that and noticed that the cool people had the white earbuds, and they began to put it into their advertising. And the white earbuds became the hero, the piece of iconography that said, this is who we are, and you belong if you have one of these.
With the iPod, the word-of-mouth messaging wasn't only coming from the corporation. It was coming from that cool DJ that was using it at a party, or the fashion designer who's designing a line of accessories for the iPod. And that's what gave it its legitimacy.
Sensing its growing popularity, the media jumped on the iPod bandwagon. Soon, the little white device was news. Articles on celebrity playlists and TV stories added even more buzz to the growing iPod craze.
Sales of digital players are expected to top the 10 million mark this year. But the trendsetter, even in the nation's heartland, is the iPod with its distinctive white earbuds.
Steve started to realize that Apple was no longer going to be a computer company. Apple was a media company. In fact, I think he said the iPod was going to produce more than 50% of their revenue. Steve had already realized that this was the tail that was going to wag the dog.
Just a year and a half after the iPod's introduction, the tribe of white earbuds approached 1 million strong. The iPod phenomenon had taken hold. While sales continued to ramp up, Steve Jobs turned his attention to selling digital music. With MP3 giant Napster vanquished, the record industry struggled to figure out how they could sell music online.
After they sued Napster out of existence, the record companies were on their defensive. The public wanted digital music, and the record industry wasn't winning any points by saying no, no, no.
There were never any statistics released just exclusively about losses for Napster. But in a period of about 3 years, the industry went from almost $15.5 billion a year in annual sales to about $12.5 billion. So when you are in a world where everybody says your business should be expanding because of these great digital opportunities, it was a pretty devastating time.
People had quickly grown used to getting their digital music for free. Getting them to now pay for it wasn't going to be easy.
Nobody really knew what distribution business model was going to work, whether it would be selling downloads, selling albums, or subscription services. The few businesses that had started a subscription weren't doing very well.
While record labels and technology companies began to discuss launching their own initiatives, Steve Jobs had a plan. An online music store where millions of songs from every record label would be available for purchase. Users would buy them and seamlessly transfer them to their iPods.
Steve, I think, understood in a way that very few people did, that you wanted to own your own music. It was your music. You bought a CD, it was yours. The great idea of the record industry was that you were going to buy a subscription to their music. And as long as you paid, you could listen to their song. But if you stopped paying, you'd lose it. So essentially, you were renting music. Steve told them from the very beginning this was a brain-dead idea.
Actually, the labels were not interested in doing a deal with Apple at all. And to understand why, you kind of have to look at the relationship that happened between labels and MTV about 2 decades earlier. So MTV took off as this little startup, this company that could only show videos. And what ended up happening over the next 2 decades was that MTV basically became the power broker in the music industry. So the thinking when Apple came along was, well, why are we going to create this other powerhouse outside of our building? We don't want to do it.
But the recording industry learned that it's not easy to say no to Steve Jobs.
I think his intensity and charisma and just selling this thing was really important. I mean, he was an evangelist like none of the other tech companies had. You know, Microsoft would send their, VP of doodads into meetings with music folks. There aren't too many computer industry CEOs that artists are able or willing to sit down and talk to. But Steve, people wanted to meet.
Steve cared so much about the record industry and getting the music for iTunes that he would fly down to Burbank all the time to go talk to record industry executives. He became a regular on Southwest Airlines. Steve Jobs had the personality and the charisma and the name to get into people who no one else could get into. To be able to go to Dr. Dre, a notorious rapper, and be able to convince him that he should download his songs through the iPod and iTunes world.
The labels were intrigued with Jobs' pitch, but there was one sticking point. Jobs wanted to sell individual songs at 99 cents a pop. Some of the record companies and their artists demanded he sell albums in their entirety.
It wasn't so much that the record companies believed that Steve had the model with selling singles. It's that Steve believed he had the model. And what he said to them was, I want to do this, and the only way I'm willing to do it, if you let me tear these albums apart. U2, they said, no, we create concept albums and we want you to sell our whole album. And literally Steve and Bono and The Edge, they all spent time together, and Steve convinced them to give his idea a try. And ultimately, Bono and U2 became one of the iPod's greatest salesmen.
On the 28th of April, 2003, after months of wrangling with executives and artists, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store. With more than 200,000 songs from the 5 major labels, Jobs' idea had become a reality.
Steve made this his personal mission, and he pushed those record company CEOs to make it theirs. At one point, there was a new prototype of the music store coming out. He hadn't seen it yet. His staff was about to present it to me. He got distracted for literally a half an hour talking about the font size and the location of like 3 words on the homepage. It was the most intense level of detail I've ever seen from a CEO. It was both impressive and kind of shocking.